CityCast Pittsburgh is coming to you today, care of the Pittsburgh Opera, presenting Puccini's enduring tale of love and heartbreak, Madama Butterfly. In 4 special performances, March 22nd through the 30th, you can experience the tragic love story of Cho-Cho-san and Lieutenant Pinkerton like never before. The images, Jens, that the opera is sharing from this really are so vibrant and beautiful. And of course, it's all paired with Puccini's stunning music. Learn more at pittsburghopera.org/citycast. Pittsburgh Opera, where can we take you? Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, everybody knows about Wall Street. In fact, if you are in the stock market right now, you might be a little stressed. But back in the day, individual cities had their own stock exchanges, including here in Pittsburgh. And it all took place on the street where CityCast Pittsburgh just happens to work. I'm with a local historian to talk about what happened that drew folks to 4th Avenue in the first place and what's left of all those grand old banks. It's St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. I'm with historian, author, and Pittsburgher Mark Hauser, who's been touring the country lately, talking about our nation's oldest skyscrapers, their architecture, and of course, all the people and stories behind them. Mark, welcome back to CityCast Pittsburgh.
Megan, thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it so much. Today, we are talking about not just one building, which is your specialty, I know, but a whole street here in Pittsburgh, our version of New York's Wall Street. And we just happen to be recording inside one of its remaining masterpieces. But I want to start at the beginning. Tell me about Drake's Well.
Yes, Drake's Well was the first commercial oil well here in western Pennsylvania. Well, not here, way up the Allegheny River at Titusville. It was the first attempt to drill deliberately for oil. Now, there had been oil seeping up from the ground all along the Allegheny Valley. And in fact, there was a Pittsburgher, Sam Keir, who started out bottling that oil and selling it as a patent medicine you could drink if you had an upset stomach or rheumatism or what have you, but eventually figured out.
And it was really the Wild West of homeopathic medicines back then.
It was, but it also made a lot of black smoke.
Mm-hmm.
So he thought, if I refined this, it could be like kerosene and it would be a lamp fuel. And that attracted more investors who hired this Colonel Drake to drill for oil in Titusville. And they struck oil and they started shipping that oil right here to Pittsburgh.
What was Pittsburgh like in this era, like 1859, but also, over the course of the next 25, 30, 40 years?
Right. Pittsburgh was, an industrial powerhouse for sure. So there was iron and soon there would be steel production. And that's when Andrew Carnegie is just sort of getting his industrial start. He actually was in railroads during the Civil War, but then he'd move into his production. There were other factories all over the place. Right here on 4th Avenue, where this building, where you guys are located, there were a lot of banks here. So if you think about the technology needed for industrial processes, they also need money and financing. And so bankers were up and down this street. And so that's how this street came to eventually be known as the Wall Street of Pittsburgh, because these two things, industry and capital, kind of interconnect.
Why 4th Avenue? Why did the banks land here? Why did the petroleum exchange, what became our stock exchange, why did it all, pick this spot?
Well, that's a great question. Why the banks came here, I think one of the initial banks, the Bank of Pittsburgh, was here on 4th Avenue, and then others clustered near it. Why the stock market came here, that's another story. So Pittsburgh had its own stock market. All the cities did back then, not just New York City. And before we even had a stock market, we had a petroleum market. So like a commodities market for all of this oil that's coming down on the barges, right? They're haggling for it on the wharves.
It literally, physically, guys are out there, hands up, yelling, I want that oil, I want that oil.
Exactly. And how much they'll pay for it per barrel. And so this has to get more organized. And at first it was on the Allegheny River Wharf, but it soon moved here because this is where all the money men are.
That sounds chaotic, if I'm honest. Like down by the river, waiting for your boat to come in.
Yeah. It's probably pretty messy, too. Everyone's got these leaky barrels with
that's true.
black goo coming out of them.
What that did to our rivers, RIP. But okay, so they land here on 4th Avenue. The banks are here.
The banks are here. And there were pretty soon the refiners and the suppliers and the riverboat captains are all trying to figure out where's going to be an organized market where we can all gather, set prices, figure out so this is less chaotic. And also to lobby because of the federal taxes on oil, as it's a new discovery. I mean, it's not used as anything other than lamp fuel then, but it's handier and easier to get than what was the lamp fuel before kerosene.
Whale
oil. So
yeah.
Sperm whales. So that's why we had this huge whaling industry, is so that they could scoop this goo out of a whale and use it to light lamps in your house.
Mark, I didn't know that I knew that. That was very deep. So the stock exchange, it became a physical structure, a building here on 4th Avenue.
Yeah, and the person who paid for the first Pittsburgh petroleum exchange that then sort of morphed into a stock exchange trading, industrial shares and financial instruments too. The guy who built it was Jacob Vandergrift.
A name a lot of us are familiar with here in Pittsburgh.
Yes. So Jacob Vandergrift was a riverboat captain at first who went up there to the oil fields and was shipping oil and then turned that into a pipeline company. And he built a beautiful, beautiful building here on 4th Avenue that was the petroleum exchange and the stock exchange. Unfortunately, the building burned down. And so they needed to move to a new location, and they decided to move to what had been a bank right next door to where you guys are, here in the Benedum Trees building.
Right. And unfortunately, that one is no longer standing too. We often lament that we are right next to a loading dock, which I guess is where that stock exchange once stood.
That's right. And if people are on 4th Avenue, they can see a really cool mural that shows what the building used to look like. It looked a little bit like the White House. There's a QR code they can scan, or they can just go to goforthpittsburgh.org and, hear a little bit more and read a little bit more about this.
Yeah, it's kind of a walking history resource. It's really neat. So we have this super busy stock exchange. I was reading a little bit. By 1900, a seat on our stock exchange cost more than any other exchange in the nation outside of New York or Boston, which seems kind of impressive, but it doesn't last. How come? Why didn't our stock exchange stand the test of time?
Well, none of the regional stock exchanges lasted much longer past the 60s and 70s. I mean, just because
1960s and 70s, we're really spanning the centuries here.
So it lasted a good long time. I mean, we had a stock exchange here in Pittsburgh for basically about a century. And then eventually all that stuff goes to New York with computer trading and so forth.
Today's show is supported by the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens and their newest exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated. The CityCast crew just checked it out. It's so vivid. There are 15 panels from artist Kara Walker. If you're not familiar with her work, in this series, she places black silhouettes on top of old Harper's Weekly engravings. It's easy to forget now, but back in the day, illustrations like these were the main way a lot of people interpreted what it meant to be at war. There is a lot of patriotism and not a lot of the many free and enslaved Black men and women who lived and fought and died during this war too. Also, the prints are paired with other Harper's Weekly illustrations, so you truly get a sense of how these stories were being told at the time. And because it's the Frick, a small bonus, they actually had the original bound copies of these Harper's Weekly illustrations. Like they were just in the house, handy, ready to go, and perfect for a show like Kara Walker's. The whole experience is just such a striking and visual reminder of what you often don't see in depictions of things like the Civil War. We highly recommend it. Get your tickets to Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, now through May 25th. And learn more at thefrickpittsburgh.org. CityCast Pittsburgh is brought to you today by Kesem. An estimated 5 million children are coping right now with a parent's cancer diagnosis. Being a kid is hard enough without extra anxiety or feelings of isolation or hopelessness that can come from really heavy stuff and just trying to process their caregiver's medical treatment. That's why Kesem is trying to support these kids with fun, creative, free programs and a summer camp that help uplift them no matter what comes next. And Kesem needs you to help them make the magic. Make the Magic is Kesem's annual fundraising gala where they bring local folks together for an evening of storytelling and performance, and most importantly, the chance to make a real difference for Pittsburgh kids. There are 2 opportunities for Make the Magic coming up. Kesem at the University of Pittsburgh is celebrating March 21st at Pitt's University Club, and Kesem at Carnegie Mellon University is throwing their gala the very next day, March 22nd, at the Convention Center downtown. Pick your team, Pitt or CMU, or hey, go to both. Get your tickets now at donate.kesem.org/PittsburghMTM25 or donate.kesem.org/CMUMTM25. Again, that's Kesem, Kesem, and be part of something truly magical. Make the magic, change a life.
This episode is sponsored by Babbel. Are you holding back on foreign travel plans this year because you're afraid of the language gap? I'm not, because I have Babbel. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I'm learning Spanish on Babbel, getting ready for a trip to Mexico City. Babbel is the language learning app that gets you talking. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. Babbel has given me great lessons on getting directions, ordering in a restaurant, and making plans. And of all the things I'm doing in Mexico City, I'm probably most excited about the soccer game we're going to. So I was excited to learn how to cheer from Babbel. That'll be me you'll hear yelling, "Fuerza Tigres! Fuerza Tigres!" With over 16 million subscriptions sold, Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting our listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So what else was here on 4th Avenue?
Well, where we're sitting right now is a terrific building. We call it the Benedum Trees building, but it was originally built as the McChesney building. And it was independently built by a woman, Caroline Jones McChesney, for basically members of the stock exchange next door. So you could get an office here, and it's so fancy, as you know, with the beautiful marble and, lovely brass fixtures in the lobby. And you can even see your doorknobs here are the original beautiful brass doorknobs.
They are beautiful. They also are wont to slip from time to time. So we have accidentally knocked that off. Don't tell anyone. I also think the architecture here is also really beautiful. Even from the outside, it's hard to get a glimpse of, say, the top of our skyscrapers, big and small here in Pittsburgh. But you and your collaborator have done just such an incredible job with drone photography, like bringing these details to life for people. I had no idea that there were terracotta lion heads on the top of this building, for example, but you can see it in some of your work.
Absolutely. You're talking about the High Rises collection, and that's something people can see online at thehighrisescollection.com. But this whole street, 4th Avenue, is the location of many of the first skyscrapers in Pittsburgh, built right about the time 1900. This building, I think, is from 1906. So when skyscrapers were invented in the 1880s in places like Chicago and New York, they eventually made it to cities like Pittsburgh. And so many of them are lined along this street, and they're these gorgeous old-fashioned ones. And as you say, one of them, yours, is the one.
Not mine personally. One we are very happy to have office space in.
Yeah, absolutely.
But back to the building's inception, Miss McChesney, she had a fun nickname, O-Line. How did she come to be, this grand dam of a Pittsburgh skyscraper?
She kind of unluckily lucked into it, in the sense that her brothers and her mom and her dad all died. And so she was the sole inheritor of the family fortune. But her dad had been a judge and then later a banker. And that was kind of a thing back then. Andrew Mellon's dad was a judge who then became a banker. I'm not entirely sure how it is that judges became bankers, but I presume it must have been you meet a lot of important and influential people as a judge. And then when you're done being a judge, you've maintained a network of contacts and powerful, influential people, and you're perfectly positioned to open. Back then, a lot of banks were private, so people would open a bank. So she had this dad's bank fortune and a lot of valuable land. And so she commissioned and had built a skyscraper right here. And it was named the McChesney Building. That was her married name. She'd just gotten married. She had the building built when she was about 50 years old. And then she sold it soon after to two guys, Mike Benedum and Joe Trees, who renamed the building after themselves.
And Benedum and Trees, I feel like, are both fairly easy to find. But before we move on, Caroline Oline, she had a not amazing legacy, I think, towards the end of her life.
No, absolutely. So when I bring my tours to this building, I tell people this was the first woman in Pittsburgh to build a skyscraper. Wow, that's amazing. And then she was the first person to sell a skyscraper, for $10 million, something like that, and then took that money and went into politics. She felt very strongly about the issue of women's suffrage.
But not in a good way.
No, she was opposed to it. She headed an organization to keep women from getting the right to vote. And, fortunately, she failed in that endeavor. And so she went on to, a life in obscurity as a wealthy woman in Pittsburgh who failed to stop other women from being allowed to vote.
Yeah. And then we have one more stop, I think, across the street from where we're sitting now. It is now a Pittsburgh Parking Authority parking garage, but it used to be the Bank of Pittsburgh.
The Bank of Pittsburgh was a gorgeous edifice it was here since the mid-1800s or the early 1800s, but the one that was here at the turn of the century was built by George Post, who was a major New York architect and who was in town making another one of our first skyscrapers. In fact, today, the oldest skyscraper is still standing in Pittsburgh from the late 1890s, the Park Building. It's the one with the guys, sort of Atlas-like figures holding the roof up with their arms over their heads along the top line, the cornice line of the building. You can see it from Mellon Square Park.
So what happened to it, the Bank of Pittsburgh?
The Bank of Pittsburgh, like many banks, failed in the Depression. And in the 1940s, it was to be torn down for a parking lot. And so many people were aghast at destroying this beautiful colonnaded front that they did keep the columns on the front of it and moved them out to a cemetery, actually. So they are part of a memorial in a cemetery in Pleasant Hills.
Yeah, Jefferson Memorial, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. We tried to vote up on your work in advance.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's the columbarium. Is that what they call it? The part where you put the urns with ashes?
You're always teaching me new words, Mark.
It's a handy word to know, columbarium.
So we had this block, we had this booming stock exchange, we had our own version of Wall Street. Why is most of it gone now? What was it about the Depression or that era that, brought some of these buildings down, but then, of course, didn't bring down the one we're currently in?
Well, Mike Benedum and Joe Trees did prosper through the Depression. So they had an oil company. They both worked for oil companies in West Virginia and then struck out on their own. And by struck out, I mean to say they struck oil. And so they created a company, headquartered it here, named the building after themselves. And they went for many years with a successful international oil company. And that is why this building is in such good shape and is still standing here. And a lot of the other buildings, they kind of went out of style, out of fashion. There were newer skyscrapers invented, new techniques, new fashions in building. And so a building that looks as old-fashioned as this one was unpopular. And so many of the other ones got torn down for things like parking lots and for new buildings. But
the character of the neighborhood changed a lot in the process, too.
Surely it did. And yet, Fourth Avenue still does have a real wealth of these old antique first skyscrapers of Pittsburgh. And it's also why the street is so narrow, by the way, because when all the other streets got widened in the early part of the 20th century, all the bankers here said, you're not widening our street. We just built a beautiful skyscraper on it. So it is one of the narrowest and least trafficked streets, but it's a lovely one to stroll down and sort of gaze to the left and to the right and look up and see these beautiful facades.
Well, we're very grateful that you are frequently looking up as part of your work. Mark, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Megan. It's always so fun to be on the show.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you want to check out some of those beautiful photos we were talking about of the skyscrapers with the drones, definitely come by the Benham Trees building downtown. Mark's got an exhibit that's open from 4 to 6, Monday through Friday. Plus, he's got some tours coming up in May. He's going to take you into a few skyscrapers downtown, and you can check out these gorgeous roof views. You really get a sense of the city in a way the general public just does not usually have access to. They're so good. All that info is on his website, antiqueskyscrapers.com. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Brain reset.